Today, we're going to look at how Greek mythology shaped the book of Acts, dealing with the particular name Aeneid, and wait till you see how this connection works out in the narrative of Acts. But the bigger question I have in this whole process is how reliable, historical is this really? It's so narrative-like, and by the end of the show, you should ask yourself that question. Is this reliable history, or is this wonderful historical fiction? And I say the latter. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Today I have my guest, Dr. Michael Kochenash. Welcome back to MythVision.
Oh, thank you.
And for those of you who do not know who Dr. Kochenosh is, I want you to know he is a PhD from Claremont University. He worked with Dennis MacDonald, one of his teachers, actually, is a Radboud Excellence Initiative Fellow at Radboud University in Netherlands, specializing in New Testament early Christianity. He has published a book, Roman Self-Representation and the Lucan Kingdom of God. It is available, and the website in the description is kochenosh.wixsite.com. You'll see the link down below. With that being said, what do you have for us today?
So today I'll be talking about a narrative in the book of Acts where Peter heals a man named Aeneas, and I'll describe how the name Aeneas functions from a literary critical perspective by relating it to cultural associations with the name Aeneas in the ancient Mediterranean world. In short, the name Aeneas was intimately connected with the city of Rome, and so I'll ultimately argue that the entire Aeneas episode in Acts 9 can be understood as a literary signpost indicating that Rome is the geographic destination of the narrative. When scholars discuss Aeneas' name, and they typically don't, they often dismiss it as insignificant. For example, in a footnote in his Hermeneia commentary on Acts, Richard Purvo simply says, "Names are usually secondary details. Aeneas is attested for Palestinian Jews from the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE," citing the essay by Margaret Williams that appears in the book of Acts in its ancient Palestinian setting. Although Purvo does accurately report the range of attestation presented by Williams, his phrasing is misleading. In fact, Williams is able to muster only one attestation each for the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, and both of these come from Josephus. The only inscriptional evidence, and as it should happen, the only other attestation she provides, is one occurrence of the name in the 4th century CE. Ken Dowden's entry on the name Aeneas in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, however, does acknowledge the cultural significance of Aeneas' name before he then dismisses it. He writes, "It may seem curious that so elevated a name should be assigned to the cripple in Acts 9:33-34, but Greek culture was unlikely to have taken cognizance of a Latin text such as Virgil's, referring to the Aeneid, of which Aeneas is the protagonist." He then ironically concludes, "It is best regarded as a solid, traditional name dignified by its bearer in Homeric epic." He then notes that there are very few occurrences of the name Aeneas after the time of Christ, according to the lexicon of Greek personal names, but he discounts this observation as probably a sampling error. And there are two problems with Dowden's assessment. First, as I've already hinted, and as I will explain later, the heroic nature of Aeneas' name was well known among Greeks who didn't know Latin long before Virgil's epic. And second, his evaluation is also disadvantaged by a lack of data, having access only to the first volume of the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names when the first edition of the Dictionary of Deities and Demons was published. 6 additional volumes are now available, and as of 2017, when I published this article, 3 more were forthcoming, but the data was accessible at that point through the editors, and that's how I got access to it. The newer editions of the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names confirm the so-called sampling error of the first volume, that is, that Aeneas was not a popular name in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era in the Roman Mediterranean world. Moreover, According to the lexicon data, Aeneas was never a popular name in Syria and Palestine. There exist 6 attestations of the name Aeneas in Palestine, one of which is Acts, and one in Syria within the entire chronological purview of the Lexicon Project, which is from the emergence of written Greek until the 6th century of the Common Era. So it apparently was a very uncommon name in these regions in terms of real life people being named Aeneas, as far as we can tell. Given how rare Aeneas was as a personal name, we have good reason to explore the cultural freight that it carried in the Roman Mediterranean world, and to consider whether such capital might account for why his name appears in Acts. For the next few minutes, I will talk about the antiquity and ubiquity of Aeneas's connection to the city of Rome, and then I'll describe a literary analysis of the Aeneas narrative in Acts that assumes the cultural competence necessary to recognize this association of Aeneas with Rome. So first, a bit about the famous Aeneas in antiquity. Aeneas was a hero in the Trojan War on the Trojan side. He was Hector's cousin, if that helps you place him. His escape from the Greek destruction of Troy was apparently narrated by Arctinus in the now lost Iliupersus. In Homer's Iliad, Aeneas is saved from Aphrodite and once by Poseidon. According to Homer, Aeneas was saved by the gods because of his future, prophesied by Poseidon as a king of the Trojans in the future. And this is a topic that is elaborated in one of the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite. The connection of Aeneas with Rome was most commonly invoked beginning in the 3rd century BCE within the political context of the Roman Republic's relations with Greek cities. And I'll give 3 examples. In the Pyrrhic War, Pyrrhus, the ruler of Epirus, appropriated the legacy of Achilles, and thereby identifying the enemy Romans as Homer's Trojans by default. And yet, by 275, the new Trojans actually won. I should note here that witnesses such as the Greek historian Timaeus suggest that this identification, that is of the Romans with Aeneas, had already been well established. In the First Punic War, the city of Segesta created an alliance with Rome on the basis of their common claim of a descent from Aeneas. And then third, the Romans made a symbolic move toward the end of the Hannibalic War, further suggesting that Romans as a group began to identify themselves as corporate descendants of Aeneas. With victory all but assured, the Romans moved the cult of Magna Mater, a protective deity of the Trojans, from Mount Ida, which is the traditional birthplace of Aeneas, to the Palatine in Rome. And this transfer took place in 205 BCE. All 3 of these examples presuppose the legend of Aeneas's travel to Italy. The appropriation of Aeneas's legacy and of Trojan identity reappeared during the reign of Julius Caesar, who was consul from 60 to 44 BCE. Caesar is said to have so emphasized his descent from Venus, Aeneas's mother, that descendant of Venus could be used as a substitute for his name. Toward the end of his life, he added a claim of descent from Aeneas specifically to that of descent from Venus, so making explicit what was already implicit. With the formation of the Second Triumvirate after Julius's death, the Roman state was governed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Although Octavian associated himself primarily with Apollo, he also began advertising his descent from Aeneas during this period. As Augustus, he not only expanded this propaganda to include public monuments in Rome, he also promoted his genealogy throughout the empire in at least 2 other ways. First, by depicting Aeneas carrying his father out of Troy on the reverse of coins that featured his own likeness on the obverse, on the other side. And 2, by commissioning several court poets to disseminate his descent from Aeneas. 2 literary figures who were active during Augustus's reign merit special attention in this context. Virgil, on the one hand, for composing the iconic and authoritative version of Aeneas's legend, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus for his inability to deny Aeneas's connection to Rome. So in the Aeneid, Virgil narrates the sea voyages of Aeneas and a remnant of Trojans across the Mediterranean Sea, so from the destruction of Troy, and their subsequent war with the Latins in Italy. Virgil explicitly identifies Augustus as the descendant of Aeneas and as the heir to the promise of an eternal empire. Virgil's epic poem experienced immense popularity soon after it was published in 19 BCE, following the poet's premature death. Around the same time, Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote about the history of Rome, emphasizing its Greek origins whenever possible. If he thought doing so would be credible, he certainly would have omitted any role played by Aeneas, a Trojan, in the foundation of Rome. But instead, he resorts to claiming that Aeneas's ancestor, who gave rise to the Trojan people, was actually from a southern Greek peninsula and then only migrated to the Troad after his homeland was flooded. Virgil says this ancestor was actually from central Italy, so it's contested. But the point is, Virgil and Dionysius both demonstrate that by the end of the 1st century, before the Common Era, the association of Aeneas with Rome had become culturally undeniable. Greek speakers in the provinces of the Roman Empire also attest to the ubiquity of Aeneas's association with Rome. For example, Book 11 of the Jewish collection of Sibylline oracles, probably written early in the 1st century of the Common Era, not only demonstrates an awareness of Aeneas's escape from Troy and the tradition that he established Rome, but he also praises the bard, quote, by whose noble mind the whole world will be educated, meaning Virgil. After describing the fall of Troy at the hands of a wooden deceit, meaning the Trojan horse, and the death of Agamemnon at the hands of a deceitful woman, meaning Clytemnestra, his wife, the Sibyl describes Aeneas. Although she cryptically avoids Aeneas's name, there is no doubt that Aeneas is the subject of this section. And the Sibyl is significant for the present discussion of Acts in that the Sibyl not only associates Aeneas with Rome, she also explicitly claims that Aeneas himself founded Rome, the mighty city of the Latins. And though the oracle is written in Greek, the writer demonstrates an acquaintance with the Aeneid, which is written in Latin, by describing Virgil immediately following the section on Aeneas. Roman claims of descent from Aeneas did not cease along with the Julian dynasty. For example, Statius, a court poet for Domitian, writing toward the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, attempted Virgil's strategy by portraying Domitian as a direct descendant of Aeneas and as the true heir of Aeneas's eternal empire. Hadrian similarly identified Trajan as the descendant of Aeneas. And so it's within this literary and political context that I conclude it would have been highly unlikely for ancient readers to hear the name Aeneas and not think of Rome, at least on some level. I liken the ancient cognitive association of Aeneas and Rome with the 21st century association of Michael Jordan and basketball. On some level, if you hear Michael Jordan, you're thinking of basketball, one way or another. So let's talk about Aeneas in Acts. Accounting for the cultural freight carried by the name Aeneas and its placement within the Acts narrative can influence how readers understand the macro structure of Acts and its relation to that of Luke. The structural considerations that I'll describe reveal how reading Aeneas as a literary signpost for Rome coheres with the macro structure of Acts. And Luke's gospel and the book of Acts actually share remarkably similar macro structures. After the preliminary matter of Luke's gospel, that is the first 3 chapters, there are 3 main sections: in and around Galilee, and Luke marks a transition to the gospel's second section in a very conspicuous manner, that is Jesus's journey to Jerusalem. In Luke 9:51, the narrator explains, "But when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he himself set his face to go to Jerusalem." He then repeats this idea 2 verses later. And these verses set the tone for all of Luke's second section. Although Jesus does not travel directly to Jerusalem, his circuitous meanderings never lose sight of that goal. The final section of Luke's gospel commences with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and narrates his activity there, namely his teachings in the temple, his trial, passion, resurrection, and ascension. A careful investigation of Acts reveals a macro structure that is remarkably similar to that of Luke's gospel. Commentators often read the structure of Acts in relation to the commission of the resurrected Jesus to his disciples in Acts 1:8, where Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." The first 3 reference, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, these are straightforward enough. But the final one is ambiguous, the end of the earth. It appears to have 2 primary meanings. First, it refers literally to the broad horizon of the known world and its inhabitants, for example, as symbolized by Ethiopia. And second, it refers to Rome, the center of the Mediterranean world, and perhaps a symbol of its entirety. The narrative which follows the introduction of Acts thus exhibits the following structure related both to geography and to ethnic and religious identities. As in Luke's gospel, the text can be divided into 3 sections. In the first section, the narrative is concerned primarily with Jesus' followers' mission to Jews. Geographically, the narrative begins where Luke's left off, in Jerusalem. Their mission extends to Jews in the rest of Judea and Samaria, even to Jews from the ends of the earth, meaning the Pentecost narrative, where Jews from all over are gathered in Jerusalem, and also the narrative of the Ethiopian eunuch. The second section narrates the beginning and progressive expansion of the Gentile mission, as well as the realization of Rome as the city of destiny in Acts. The Gentile mission explicitly begins with the account of Peter and Cornelius, which is prefaced by a pair of miracle narratives featuring Peter with Aeneas and then Peter with Tabitha. The subsequent progressive realization of the inclusion of Gentiles is highlighted by the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 and Paul's experience of opposition from some Jews and the redirection of his ministry, of his mission to include Gentiles. At the same time, the geographic goal of the book of Acts becomes explicit in this second section. Paul must see Rome. The third and final section of Acts, bearing some resemblance to the final section of Luke's gospel, recounts Paul's trials in Jerusalem and Caesarea and his sea voyage to Rome. Although the narrative foregrounds these activities, the 2 trajectories that began in the Peter narratives in Acts 9:32 through 11:18 continue. That's the Peter with Aeneas and Tabitha and Cornelius. For instance, Paul concludes his defense before a crowd in Jerusalem by relating the words spoken to him by the risen Jesus, where Jesus says, "Go, I will send you far away," this is geographic, "to the Gentiles," the ethnic and religious. Paul's speech to the Jews in Rome is thus a fitting capstone to Luke's foundation narrative, where he says, "Let it be known to you then that the salvation of God has been sent to Gentiles." And again, he's saying this in Rome. The 2 miracle stories featuring Aeneas and Tabitha in Acts 9 thus occupy a critical place within the narrative of Acts, not to mention the whole of Luke's 2-volume work. It functions as the narrative's gateway to the Gentile mission and to Rome itself. The narratives of Peter healing Aeneas and raising Tabitha from the dead in Joppa bridge the gap between Luke's summary statement in Acts 9:31, which I will quote in a minute, and the Cornelius narrative in which a Roman soldier becomes the first Gentile to gain inclusion into the kingdom of God in Luke or Acts. I argue that this bridge is constructed using 2 metonymies, Aeneas and Joppa. And by metonymy, I mean a word that is used as a stand-in for a larger conceptual structure or system of which it is a part. The first major section of Acts concludes with the notice, that the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and was built up. Of all of the so-called success summaries in the book of Acts, 9:31 is remarkable for the way in which it evokes Jesus' commission in Acts 1:8. The disciples are to be Jesus' witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. For the reader who recalls Jesus' commission, the summary of Acts 9:31 might prompt a question. What about the end of the earth? The audience resumes the Acts narrative and immediately encounters Peter healing a man who had been paralyzed for 8 years, named Aeneas. In this way, the narrative can be understood as answering that reader's question. In the book of Acts, as far as the movement of Jesus' followers is concerned, Rome will represent the end of the earth. And that the narrative does, in fact, end in Rome, confirms the credibility of reading Aeneas' name as a metonym for the imperial capital. The inclusion of Cornelius, a Roman soldier from Italy, in Acts 10 through 11 reinforces the Aeneas-Rome trajectory, forming a piece of a narrative thread spanning from Acts 9:32 through Paul's travels to Roman cities in Philippi, Corinth, Ephesus, all the way to his arrival in Rome. The narrative of Peter raising Tabitha from the dead can be read as initiating a second literary trajectory, that of Gentile inclusion, via the repeated mention of Joppa. It may also reinforce the earlier Acts Aeneas-Rome trajectory. Luke repeats the name Joppa 4 times in the Tabitha narrative. It's only 162 words, and 6 more times within the Cornelius narrative that follows. But why does Acts identify Joppa with what is uncharacteristic frequency? According to one rhetorical handbook, reiteration of the same word makes a deep impression upon the hearer and inflicts a major wound upon the opposition, as if a weapon should repeatedly pierce the same part of the body. The wound inflicted by the narrative can be identified in this case by attending to the cultural and literary freight carried by the name Joppa. I suggest that this repetition evokes the logic of the Jonah narrative, preparing the audience for the characterization of Peter in the Cornelius narrative as a Jonah figure, and for the inclusion of Gentiles more generally. 2 themes of Jonah's mission are particularly relevant to these stories: Jonah's commission to preach to Gentiles and his reluctance to actually do it. Jonah was in the port city, Joppa, was the port city to which Jonah fled in order to avoid preaching to Ninevites. In Acts 9:36-43, the narrative inflicts, as some rhetorical handbooks might say, a Joppa-shaped wound on the readers, situating Peter in Joppa and evoking the thought world of Jonah. It comes as no surprise then that Peter is characterized as a reluctant missionary to Gentiles in Acts 10. Peter is still in Joppa when Cornelius sends for him, and before the emissaries arrive, Peter has a vision about clean and unclean animals, in which he refuses to eat the unclean animals 3 times, which is a metaphor, as readers learn, for Gentile inclusion. Luke's Peter is remarkably more obedient than Jonah, however. Whereas Jonah left Joppa on a ship to avoid preaching to Gentiles, after his vision, Peter abandons his reluctance in Joppa and initiates a Gentile mission. The Tabitha narrative thus commences a second literary thread, that of Gentile inclusion, that likewise stretches all the way to the end of Acts. It may be worth noting that by evoking the thought world of Jonah, the Tabitha story can be read as reinforcing the narrative thread established in the preceding passage, the destination of Rome. The entire Jonah story revolves around the so-called prophet's mission to preach to Gentiles in the city of Nineveh. And Nineveh, of course, was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, during whose reign the Jonah story is set. So in addition to the idea of ministry to Gentiles, a reference to Jonah can evoke the narrative's imperial logic, movement to the capital of the empire to preach to Gentiles. In the Acts narrative, that capital is Rome. The final 2 chapters of Acts bring the narrative threads initiated in the Aeneas and Tabitha stories to a close. Scholars have long noted the parallels that Acts 27 shares with other ancient narratives, particularly Homer's Odyssey and the Book of Jonah. In Acts 27, it is Paul who plays the role of Jonah, getting caught in a dramatic storm while voyaging across the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, whereas Jonah embarked on a Mediterranean ship in order to avoid preaching to Gentiles in the capital of the Assyrian Empire, Paul, in Roman custody, sails across the Mediterranean Sea precisely in order to preach to Gentiles in the capital of the Roman Empire. While the presence of Homeric vocabulary here is practically undeniable, Paul's sea voyages to Rome, which begin in Troas in Acts 16 and end in Rome in Acts 28, recall yet another cultural figure, Aeneas. Aeneas traveled from Troy to Italy in order to establish the foundations of the Roman Empire. Paul travels from Troas to Rome with a mission to proclaim the kingdom of God as a witness to Jesus. In Acts 28:14, Paul arrives in Rome. Although under house arrest, he is able to meet with the local Jewish leaders. After the Roman Jews offer a predictably, that is, according to narrative-informed expectations, a predictably mixed reception of Paul's message, Paul proclaims, "Let it be known to you then that this salvation of God has been sent to Gentiles. They will listen." Then the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome, welcoming all who come to him, underscoring the permanence of the inclusion of Gentiles within his ministry. Thus conclude both literary threads initiated in the Aeneas and Tabitha stories. So that's my argument. The Acts narrative's tandem of healing miracles about Aeneas and Tabitha signals the agenda for the remainder of Acts. After providing a satisfying closure to the Jewish mission within Judea and Samaria in Acts 9:31, Acts narrates the healing of a man named Aeneas and the resuscitation of a woman in Joppa. The story of Aeneas suggests that the narrative will find its ultimate goal in the city of Rome. The story of Tabitha, situated in Joppa, suggests that the mission will continue by expanding, even if the missionary is at first reluctant, to include Gentiles, while also recalling the idea of ministry in the imperial capital. And in any case, that is how Greek mythology shapes the book of Acts.
Wow, that was amazing. I'm absolutely impressed by that. You made Acts look easy and simplified things in a way that it makes me want to reread it and get back into this. I really hope people will go get a copy of your book as well. The link is down in the description. There are so many things I'd love to just highlight and go into with you, but maybe in the future we can do an episode where we can have Q&A and dive into this kind of material. But I'm impressed. I'm impressed. I love the connections to Jonah. I love the connections to the Roman idea of Aeneas, the reluctance of Peter. I've been pointing out some of these things, but I never knew the Roman connection. Never really grabbed that. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you for having me on.
Would you like to say any final words for everybody?
No. So this is based on a paper that was published in 2017, and I've sent the link. It's posted on my academia site, so I'll have Derek post a link to it there if you want to read the entire thing, which is a little longer than that, but that's most of it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kochenosh. And ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.